So Marquis has offered four arguments that he thinks help to bolster the case that flow is the real source of the right to life, and that as a result, fetuses, which are creatures, entities that have flow, have a right to life, and that depriving creatures with flow of a future like ours constitutes harming them, and as a result is morally wrong. Now that he's going to want to present objections to this view, reasons why people might not think that flow is a good argument for fetuses having a right to life, and his responses to those objections. So he's going to consider four objections. The first objection is an objection that questions whether or not you can establish rights for individuals on the basis of their potentiality, of their not actualized abilities or qualities. The second premise, or the second objection rather, is going to argue that fetuses, since they are not currently sentient, lack interests and hence aren't harmed by depriving them of their flow, of their future like ours. The third argument suggests that the flow position has this undesirable and unintuitive consequence that there are differences between individuals in terms of how much flow they have, so different quantities of flow, and the quality of their flow, the quality of their future, that would seem to result in them having different harms being done to them by ending their lives, and hence seems to make a case that they have a differential right to life. Some people have a greater right to life, are harmed more by being killed than other people, and this, the argument asserts, is counterintuitive. It goes against our judgments and intentions in attributing rights to individuals. And the final objection that he will consider is an objection that flow not only seems to render abortions morally wrong, but it also seems to render other actions that we don't normally consider to be morally wrong or in any way, shape, or form on par with abortion or murder, like practicing abstinence or using contraception. That flow seems to have the implication that these are just as morally wrong as murder or abortion. And so he'll lay out each of these objections and then try to respond to each of them. And we'll want to look at his responses and see what we think, as well as looking at the objections and seeing how compelling we find them. So the first objection that he considers is this idea that, look, flow depends on the potential of fetuses to be in a state of a certain kind in the future, being potential creatures that are enjoying the goods of consciousness, to be creatures that potentially have a future like ours. But, the objection goes, appeals to potentiality are illegitimate or inappropriate bases for attributing rights to fetuses. So the supposition that adults have rights in virtue of the fact that they have this potential future like ours is an inappropriate basis for supposing the fetuses, who are potential adults that have this potential future like ours, have those rights as well. And the way he characterizes this objection specifically is given on page 761. And I'm going to quote the article here to, in his own words, express how he understands this objection. So he says, the premise one needs to add to make it valid, that is, to make it a valid argument that fetuses only potentially have futures like ours, whereas adults do have futures like ours. And hence, we are illegitimately or inappropriately attributing rights to fetuses on the basis that the potential to be like adults who actually have flow. that's how he understands the uh, objection to his argument. Right? He thinks that this mischaracterizes the nature of the argument. So he says the premise that you need to make it valid, that is, the inference from the rights of adults to the rights of potential adults, is something like this. If X's have the right to Y, then potential X's have the right to Y. And he acknowledges in this quotation mark that this premise is, as he characterizes it, is plainly false. It's not obviously true. It's certainly not an unproblematic assumption in an argument. And he gives us examples of why it looks problematic. So he says, look, potential presidents don't have the rights of the presidency. Potential voters don't have the right to vote. And so this idea that something that has an actual property has a particular right in virtue of having that property, that doesn't license us to suppose that things that potentially have that property also have that right. And that seems to be the crux of the objection. Now, his response to this objection, well, let's just go over the response. So he thinks the flow depends on potentiality, that it grants rights to adults and to fetuses on the basis of their potentiality, that a future like ours is the potential to have the goods of consciousness in the future. It isn't something that is had by adults and potentially had by fetuses. It's a potential for both. And so he then thinks that flow doesn't make an illegitimate and inconsistent appeal that goes from the actual flow had by adults and then on the basis of the potential of fetuses to become adults attributes the same right that they would have if they did have flow to them. He says that's not what the argument that he's forwarding does. And so on page 761 and over into page 762, he tells readers, the flow theory of the wrongness of killing adults is based upon the adult's potentiality to have a future of value. Potentiality is the argument from the very beginning. Thus, the plainly false premise is not required. So his response to this objection seems to turn on the idea that I'm not appealing to the potential of a fetus to have flow. Flow is a potential that's had equally by a fetus and an adult, in virtue of which it has a right to life. Now, this response to that objection, I think, really doesn't address the concern that gives rise to the objection. I mean, I think that it's at least plausible to suppose, when we think about this objection, that the person is objecting to the idea that we're attributing rights to individuals on the basis of their potential to exhibit some properties or to experience some state, and that this kind of attribution of rights based on a potential that isn't actualized, but is merely a potential, a hypothetical development, isn't a legitimate grounds for attributing rights to someone. And that would go for both the adult and for the fetus on this account. And so objections that you're treating adults and fetuses differently, I don't think are responses to the objection that you're treating adults and fetuses differently. I don't think that actually addresses the concern. The concern is whether or not the potential that's attributed to both adults and the fetuses is sufficient grounds for them granting them a particular right or justifying the supposition that they have that right. That merely having the potential to do something doesn't seem to grant you rights for all the sorts of examples and reasons that he notes in the president and the voting case. So your potential to make $1 million doesn't in any way justify me in granting you the right to $1 million. And so the potential to have a life where you manifest the properties that we associate with personhood, that isn't obviously on this objection a sufficient reason to grant you those rights or to suppose that you have those rights independent of whether or not you actually are currently manifested or will eventually manifest them. And so I think that's the crux of the objection here, and I'm not sure. I think people have to decide for themselves whether or not Marquis actually addresses the concern that's being raised here.